A kingdom has erupted into a violent civil war, and the king is calling for aid from all across the realms to help end this bloody rebellion. When you arrive, you learn that the rebels feel that they are being harshly taxed, that their food is being taken away from them and given over to the nobility to host lavish and frivolous feasts, and that even minor crimes are being harshly punished by the king, and that loved ones often are imprisoned or go missing for stealing a loaf of bread. However, the rebels' tactics are incredibly violent. They poison the king's soldiers using agents within the army. They ambush messengers on the road and display their executed bodies. And they burn the crops of their fellow peasants who haven't sided with the rebellion, even if they haven't necessarily sided with the king. There are also rumours that there are lycanthropes and other monsters hiding among the rebels' ranks, and so the king's soldiers feel incredibly justified in their crusade. However, it's difficult for you to discern how much of this is fact and how much of it is part of the king's propaganda machine. If you side with the rebels, then you're going to lead to a protracted and violent war. There's going to be a lot of people caught in the crossfire, and some noble families that aren't corrupt are going to be slaughtered by overzealous rebels. What's worse is that neighbouring nations may not want to treat or trade with a rebel state, and in fact that may lead to future wars. If you side with the king, then there's going to be less of a chance of an equitable future for everybody. What is it you decide to do? Hello, my name is Byrne, and this is what you need to know about running Dungeons & Dragons. Moral dilemmas sit at the heart of most dark fantasy narratives because dark fantasy explores the uncomfortable imperfection of humanity.
Their morals, their code. It's a bad joke.
There are no shining knights, all benevolent kings, or all powerful wizards that are going to come and save the day. And inversely, dark fantasy likes to explore the uncomfortable idea that not all villains are perfectly villainous. Even the most vile, the most corrupt, the most despicable individuals can still have redemptive or relatable qualities to them.
Everyone creates the thing they dread. Men of peace create engines of war. Invaders create avengers.
Dark fantasy, for this reason, doesn't always slot easily into a tabletop RPG where the players often want to be the arbiters of justice. They don't want to have to think too hard about whether killing the goblin is ethical or just. But taking the time to craft a dark fantasy campaign carefully for your players to engage with can create an incredibly immersive story where your players really feel the consequences of their actions, for good or for ill. In this video, I'm going to explain the steps that I take to create a dark fantasy campaign, narratively speaking, and there are 5 steps that I take, which are to firstly create a central conflict, or what's often referred to as a story hook for a campaign, or a campaign hook. The second thing is to define your heroes and your villains, and this isn't necessarily the player characters, this is the folks that sit on either side of the central conflict. Third, you want to ensure that there are no good options. Neither side of the central conflict should have a clear higher moral standing. Both sides should have good points and negative points to their argument. Fourth is to add texture. Add other NPCs, minor NPCs that have a stake in the conflict, but they might not agree with either side. These create side quests or alternative options for your characters to choose. The central conflict doesn't have to be binary. And finally, you know you've been successful in crafting a dark fantasy narrative if the players have to stop and ask themselves,
Hans, are we the baddies?
Let's dive into these 5 ideas about how to craft a dark fantasy D&D campaign. And if you enjoy this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel because I'm going to be talking about more ideas and giving more advice about how to run Dungeons & Dragons in a dark fantasy atmosphere. The way that most DMs might start planning their D&D campaign is to think of a story hook, or what I call the central conflict. And these can be pretty straightforward. A dragon is attacking an ancient city because it's angry, or the necromancer is trying to become a lich, or a monster is haunting the woods just outside of town. All of these story hooks seem pretty straightforward, but Dark Fantasy wants to complicate them, so that when we delve a little deeper, we learn that the dragon is attacking the city because a noble knight from the city killed their mate. The necromancer is a survivor from a vampire dungeon, and they're looking to gain power so that they can take their revenge. And the monster in the woods was once a knight themselves, but has been cursed by a fae queen for accidentally offending them. In adding more complexity to these story hooks, Dark Fantasy is aiming to do two things. The first is to subvert expectations. Tabletop RPG players are very used to being pointed at a thing and told to go and kill it and take its stuff. There's goblins out in the woods, they're attacking the village, let's go kill the goblins, take their stuff, story opened and closed. What seems like a simple situation at first, once they arrive and start investigating, should become much more complicated. And the second thing is to ensure that there isn't necessarily an easy solution to this conflict, or there is, but it's not necessarily the most moralistic solution. So, for example, the easiest solution is just kill the dragon attacking the village. Go out and kill the witch living in the woods. Stop the necromancer violently from becoming a lich. But these might not be the best, most moral way of solving these conflicts. And in fact, if you have a paladin or a cleric in the party, perhaps their god demands that they find a more equitable solution for everybody involved. Once you've decided on your central conflict, the next step is to define the NPCs that sit on either side of that conflict. What do they want? Why do they want it, and how are they going to try to accomplish their goals? And this is, for example, the witch in the woods versus the village that exiled them, or the dragon that's attacking the city versus the noble knight that stole their treasure and killed their mate. Your aim is to ensure that neither side of the conflict has the clear moral high ground, because you don't want to make it a clear option for your party where they side. You want to ensure that there is debate among the party members about which is the best course of action. If you are going to have a clear villain for your campaign, such as the necromancer trying to become a lich who is killing hundreds of thousands of people on their path to do so, at least define why they are sympathetic, what it is they're trying to accomplish, and why they're doing it. The lich is traumatized by the fact that they were once tortured by vampires and is dealing with that trauma in the worst possible way. But let's look at an example of balancing the scales to ensure that neither side has the moral high ground. And we're going to look at our dragon who's attacking the city. The dragon attacked the city because their companion was killed and their treasure was stolen. The knight who did it is an unrepentant sociopath who gloats at killing the mate. The dragon has already killed hundreds as it attacked the city and is still incensed, threatening to burn the rest if their demands are not met. The dragon is also demanding so much gold out of the city in recompense that it could bankrupt the kingdom, and this could lead to a famine, or it could weaken the kingdom's military, leaving them weak against their rivals. Well, now the dragon's starting to look a little bit too villainous, so let's go back the other way. Maybe the dragon hasn't killed anyone yet, but it is threatening to do so. See the point I'm trying to make here? You can make individuals seem more villainous or less villainous. You're sort of balancing the scales, turning the dials until you get it to a state where the party are going to have a difficult time deciding who they want to side with. Dark fantasy stories very rarely end with everybody happy. And this is why, when defining your heroes and your villains, you want to ensure that the morality scales are balanced, that there's no way for the party to pick a side without getting blood on their hands. A man loves a monster that can't help but to kill innocent people. If you kill the monster, the man is distraught, destroyed even. But if you let the monster live, it's going to go on and kill more innocent people. Dark fantasy accepts that the world is not perfect, that people are not perfect, and finding easy solutions is incredibly difficult. Furthermore, sometimes a solution just isn't going to make everybody happy, or it's going to lead to more suffering. Sometimes the cost of justice and freedom is just too high. And this is what is at the center of a dark fantasy D&D campaign. More important than the horrific monsters, more important than the horror or the bats that fly up in front of a red moon, is the theme that the party may have to do terrible things to get what they want, or in the name of justice. Maybe the party do kill the dragon and they save 10,000 lives, but now they have to live with the fact that they killed a beautiful and noble creature, and they helped glorify a sociopathic knight who may go on to kill more innocent creatures or even people. The party have to face the fact that their actions, no matter how justified, led to more suffering. Do they still feel like what they did was the right thing?
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
The point isn't to gotcha your players. You don't want to flip the script on them too harshly. They should be able to see what's coming. They should be able to anticipate the writing on the wall. They should know that if they take a certain course of action, they're going to get other people killed, or they're going to cause more suffering, or there is going to be some sort of cost or personal sacrifice.
What did it cost?
Everything.
But that's part of exploring the themes of dark fantasy, making those difficult decisions, knowing full well what they may lead to. The next step is basically to just continue to add texture and complications to the narrative of your central conflict. For example, maybe the squire of the egotistical knight regrets their part in slaying the dragon's mate and wants to try to make amends. Perhaps there's a religious cult, a peaceful religious order that has grown up around the dragon. They worship the dragon and they plead with the city to empty the city's coffers and pay the dragon off to avoid further bloodshed. These extra NPCs, complications, and motivating factors can further complicate the moral implications and questions being asked by the party. But they can also add side quests and extra things for the party to do and interact with. Maybe they can manipulate the knight's squire into poisoning the knight so that the party can get rid of them quickly and easily without needing to cause a huge conflict within the castle at the center of the city. These extra textures can also create personal stakes for the party. Maybe there's a party member who's a rival with the egotistical knight. Maybe there's a party member whose family was killed by the dragon in the initial attack. Or maybe there's a party member who is motivated by gold very highly, and so they're going to be more likely to eschew the moral questions of killing the dragon if it means that they get a payoff at the end of it. Adding texture fleshes out the narrative twists and turns of the campaign. It further adds complications to the moral questions being asked, and it allows you to explore more than just the central theme of whatever the campaign is. This final piece of advice isn't necessarily something that you need to do in preparation for a dark fantasy campaign, but it is something that you should be repeatedly asking your players throughout the campaign, especially when they make a difficult moral decision. Can the players justify the actions that they're taking in seeking out justice? Is it worth the cost of justice in the end if it means that there are noble children hanging in the streets? Or are they just completely cynical characters that realize the world is a cruel and unjust place as long as they get paid and they're only looking out for themselves? And look, that's fine. There are no wrong answers in a dark fantasy campaign. You really shouldn't be judging your players yourself, and your players shouldn't necessarily be judging their characters. This is about exploring the themes in the safe space of a tabletop RPG, rather than deciding that because of the player's actions within the game, that reflects on the player themselves. That's not the case whatsoever. A lot of players, in fact, don't really enjoy being self-reflective while playing tabletop RPGs because they just use tabletop RPGs as a form of escapism or as a power fantasy, and that is totally fine. It just might mean that a dark fantasy campaign isn't necessarily for them, because for a dark fantasy campaign to be successful, you really do need a level of player buy-in in exploring the difficult themes that dark fantasy often examines. And that comes down to having a really robust past session 0 and saying to the players, look, I am running a dark fantasy campaign. I want to run a campaign that's very grounded, and I want to run a campaign where the reactions of the NPCs within the world are going to reflect how you treat them. All too often, I play D&D where the player characters threaten innocent shopkeepers who are just trying to feed their families. They kill goblins or bandits with absolutely no questions asked, and they just automatically position themselves as the hero of the story because they're the main characters.
Every time I look at you, I don't understand why you let the things you did get so out of hand.
And that doesn't quite sit right with me. I want my players to really be able to explore the themes of dark fantasy fully and embrace the fact that they might not be playing heroes. They might be playing villains. It's fine. There's no wrong answers. I'm not judging my players, and the players shouldn't judge their characters or each other based on their actions within the game. But I just want my players to be able to accept that they might not be the good guys based on their actions within the game. It's also exploring whether the cost of the justice that the party achieved through siding with the rebels or killing the dragon was worth it in the end. And that's what dark fantasy is all about, exploring themes and not necessarily having all the answers at the end. And that's it. That is how I plan out my campaign narratives when I'm running a dark fantasy campaign. I pick out what I want my central conflict to be. I define my heroes and my villains. I ensure that there's no moral high ground for the party to sit entirely upon, no matter which side of the conflict they side with. Even if they don't side with either side, even if they want to do something else entirely, go down the middle of the conflict or try to come out without any mud on them whatsoever, they're going to have to make some sort of sacrifice, whether that is moralistically, whether that is financial because they miss out on a bunch of gold for making some sort of moral decision. They're not going to get out scot-free. Not everybody's going to be happy at the end of the campaign story, and that goes for the player characters themselves. Not the players. Hopefully they're happy at the end of the campaign, or at least they feel fulfilled, they feel satisfied, they feel like they really sunk their teeth into the
themes of dark fantasy.
If you want to run a dark fantasy campaign yourself, make sure to follow this channel because every week I release a new video about what you need to know about running dark fantasy in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Give this video a like, go spread the word, and I'll see you all here next week for another video about how to run Dungeons & Dragons
Dark fantasy.